Well, let's just have a look at what the Bible says. So Genesis chapter 7, verses 11 and 12 has this wonderful description of the timing of the flood in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month. Now, we're not certain whether that's the second month of his 600th year or whether that's the second month of the calendar year, but that matters not. The 17th day of the month, the same day, were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So, what do we understand by let's just go back to that one. What do we understand by the fountains of the great deep and the windows of heaven? Well, the fountains of the deep seem to indicate that there was a lot of water, and science now is beginning to say that this is the situation. Not only is there a vast amount of water under the earth, in Africa, huge underground reservoirs of water, and apparently under the river Nile. There is another river much deeper underground that runs with greater volume than is in the river Nile. Huge amounts of water are under the earth. And God's action was to cause some of that water, which was under the earth, to come up to the surface and become like fountains, gushing up, releasing the water that was under the earth. It also talks about the rain coming down, the windows of heaven being opened. We know at creation, Genesis chapter 1, when God divided the waters from the waters under the earth to the waters that were above the earth, that there is water out into space, and some of that water came down as well as all the rain that we know about. So there's water coming up and water coming down. And the whole topography of the earth was probably changed at this time by this water's coming up and probably volcanic action as well. We know that deep down, they're found in the most deepest parts of the ocean, there are these fountains that's still going today. Sometimes with gases, sometimes with water, all sorts of things go on there. But God tells us that that's what happened. There was abundance of water because God intended to flood the earth. And Noah, who had been on the ark for 7 days before this 17th day of the month, then the ark would slowly be worn up, and the inhabitants of the earth and the creatures that were on the earth would all perish, apart from those within the ark. There was no way into the ark, was there? Once God had shut the door, then their opportunity of salvation had passed. They'd been given 120 years of Noah's preaching, but they hadn't responded. And the ark would be lifted higher and higher. And, from the description given in Genesis, the ark would look probably something like that. And Scripture is so clear, as Genesis goes on in verse 21-22, that as far as the Bible is concerned, the flood was a worldwide flood. The emphasis is so emphatic, isn't it? All flesh died that moved upon the earth, both the fowl, cattle, beast, every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man. All in whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that was in the dry land, died. And so it is quite clear that it is affecting everything. It's not a little local flood, is it? The description here is of everything being destroyed. And the next verse, verse 23, just carries on the emphasis. Every living substance was destroyed which was upon the face of the ground, both man, cattle, creeping things, fowl of the heaven. They were destroyed from the earth. And Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. So the only situation that makes sense if we're going to accept the Bible as being true, which we do. And this is our guide. We believe in God, a creator, God who brought the flood, and we look at today's world in the light of what the Bible has told us. And seeing the evidence today for a catastrophic flood as described in Genesis in these early chapters. And so it explains why we have flood stories all over the world. It explains why Noah had to build this huge ark. If it was to be a local flood, then God could have caused Noah and some of the animals to move to safer ground and then dealt with the people that's in the area of land that was occupied at that time. But no, a boat was needed because there was to be a worldwide flood. We just have a quick look at the timetable. We're not going too much emphasis on that because we want to look at the evidences for it. But it is just useful to have in our background the length of time that they were in the ark. It was over a year. And I say before this day one starts, they'd already been in the ark for 7 days. So, on the first day of the flood, the fountains were broken up. Rain ceased after 40 days and the waters began to abate, but it was 150 days before the ark grounded and 224 before the top of the mountains could be seen. And then Noah sends out the dove and the raven, eventually come back with the olive leaf, and then the dove sent out doesn't return, and then removes the ark's covering and is able to see, and not until just over a year that they actually leave the ark. What would Noah and his family do all this time? Well, there'll be a lot of work looking after all the animals. Maybe they did hibernate, but the interesting thing was that God told them to take food onto the ark for the animals as well as Noah and his family, which would indicate either that was in preparation for their early days when they came off the ark and would still need supplementary feeding, or that they had to be fed during the journey. But there's a fascinating book, it's in the lobby, it's got a picture of Noah and the ark. This chap did his thesis as to how you could look after, well, first of all, whether you fit all the animals onto the ark, which you easily can, but how you would deal with the dung and all the rest of it. It's a fascinating book. Not something you'll read from cover to cover, but dip into, unless you like boring books. But it's interesting but boring, if you get my meaning. So what we were more interested in this particular aspect is what is the evidence for the flood? Well, we look at the rocks of the earth, and I believe that these point very much to the evidence of a flood. We look at the fossils, and again, a flood is a very reasonable explanation as to how fossils were formed, whereas normally fossils don't form. When our goldfish dies or fish die in the rivers, they don't turn into fossils, do they? And the fact that there are these flood stories around the earth, we'll look at those. And it's a bit of a aside, but it's very interesting how many nations link their history back to Noah's grandsons. And one can trace every one of Noah's grandsons. You can find historical links, either names of rivers, names of places, names of country, names of people, from every one of those 16 grandsons, which bears out the truth of the biblical record that the earth was repopulated by them. But first, a bit of background. So, was it a local flood? Well, we've looked at those verses which indicate very clearly that it wasn't a local thing. There is an important little bit of information in the early verses, in verse 19 and 20, that the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. Now, why does it say 15 cubits? Why not 20 cubits? Why not 10 cubits? Why 15 cubits? Why is it so precise? Well, God told us the dimensions of the ark, that it was 30 cubits, 14 metres high. And most vessels, when they're floating in water, when they're laden, as the ark was, are about half submerged. So God is telling us that the ark would need clearance of 15 metres. And he's telling us, yes, he ensured that the waters were 15 metres at least, 15 cubits, above the top of the mountains. So, there's just an interesting little corroboration of the truth of the details that Moses penned, which we can read. It makes sense. The ark was able to safely, for a year, just float around without grounding on any hills. Now, we think of the height of the mountains today, and we think, well, that's going to be a terrific lot of water to flood the mountains to a great height. Mount Ararat, where the ark came to rest, is a pretty high mountain today, and just travel further eastward, and of course we have the Himalayas and Mount Everest at nearly 9,000 metres high. So does it mean that the waters were, maths isn't that good, 8,863 metres above sea level? No. It seemed quite clear that the mountains before the flood didn't exist as we know them today. There is a verse in Psalm 104 which, in the first instance, is talking about God's creation on day 3 when there was the separation of the land from the seas, and it seemed quite clear that the land masses rose up and the waters would flow off and create the valleys and the gorges. And it would seem that a very similar process was at the end of the flood. And when God's got a good way of doing things, why not repeat it? So that as well as the water draining, there were changes in sea levels. It speaks, we'll just go to the latter part here, talking about the waters. They go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys unto the place which thou hast founded for them. It seems to indicate, as I say, earth, mountains beginning to rise and valleys sinking down, and then all the waters would run into their positions. And I believe that after the flood, for quite a period of time, there was the cataclysmic forces that God released in the flood had the effect of raising the land masses. And that would be a reason why we then get continents like Australia, which are now completely separated from other land masses. But in the time after the floods, while the animals and man was migrating, there would still be these land bridges. But as land masses rose and still shrinking valleys and the seas, that then these became islands. It talks in Genesis chapter 7 of the fountains of the great deep being broken up. And so that indicates some earth movements. And when we come to Genesis chapter 10, we have this rather enigmatic verse that unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg, meaning divided, division, because in his days the earth was divided. Now, that could be the time when Babel was, and it is a division of language. But it could equally be that during his time there were quite violent movements of the earth which caused quite a lot of the separation of the land masses. And we can't be sure, but it fits into this general picture that the mountains, and the mountains are still rising today, that this process is still going on. They have to recalibrate the height of the mountains because they're still rising. Peleg was born 100 years after the flood and lived 239 years. So, why build an ark if there's a local flood? Why? But let's look at this evidence of the rocks. So I'll just put that slide back on again. In very simplistic terms, and I'm talking very simplistic terms, 10% of the Earth's rocks are what are termed sedimentary, and 90% are igneous. So in the igneous, we're involving the granites and all the other things. I'll say we're just simplifying it just for these purposes. But on the surface of the Earth, it's reversed. 75% of the rocks on the Earth are sedimentary, and 25% are igneous, volcanic, which have come up through the sedimentary and are lying on top of it, which would indicate that at one time the Earth was covered in sedimentary, waterborne layers, sediment, rocks, and with the volcanic coming up through. So that points to some big catastrophe to cause sedimentation. Sedimentation is movement of water and the dropping out from the water movement of the particles which are being carried by this water and the separation of them into different layers. And as I say, the floods is the wonderful solution, really, to the rocks that we see today. Fossils are found in the sedimentary layers. They're not found in the igneous, they're found in the sedimentary and the waterborne layers. And, as I said earlier, creatures don't fossilise when they die. They get scavenged, they get eaten, they just disintegrate. In order to be fossilised, you have to be buried very rapidly, and you have to have pressure and you have to have temperature. All the things that are present in the time of the flood, but aren't present in normal everyday life. When a creature dies, there isn't anything to bury it, and there is no pressure involved or heat. It points to some catastrophe that has caused this. And the fossils are formed from living creatures, not dead creatures. See, evolutionists say a creature dies and it turns into a fossil. Well, there are certain things which we shall see that indicates that the animals were alive when they were fossilised, not dead. So fossils don't normally occur. It points to something catastrophic, and it needs this rapid, deep burial to cause them. And we have fossils which penetrate up through many different layers, which again is a great difficulty for the evolutionists, because they think that, a huge layer represents thousands of years, so how could you have a tree being preserved going through many, many layers? So 95% of the fossils are marine invertebrates, in other words, creatures living in the sea. And yet we find their fossils on land. So how do we explain that? Well, the flood explains it because they were carried there, but how do you explain, under naturalistic ways, that we find all these fossils of sea creatures in the middle of Nottingham or wherever? The rest of the fossils are mainly vertebrate fish, and the animals and human fossils are very rare in comparative terms. Now, the evolutionists say that the Cambrian layer, the layer at the bottom, is where we find the first fossils. There are some in Precambrian, but they're usually disputed. But the first clear fossils are all in the bottom layer, what they call the Cambrian. But the thing about those fossils is they aren't simple creatures, they're complex creatures. So it is a bit of a puzzle how we have these complex creatures at the bottom of the pile, which is supposed to be the beginnings of life. It's not what the fossils talk about. And in the Cambrian layer, all the different families are all represented in the fossil. But again, how do you explain that on the evolutionary lines? And some of those families are now extinct, but no new ones have arisen afterwards. They were all there, right at the bottom of the pile. And nothing before them and nothing after, which would indicate a change from one creature to another. So if the fossils aren't as a result of the worldwide flood, then we have to say, well, we believe the Bible. The Bible tells us there's a worldwide flood, and yet there's no trace of it if the fossils aren't as a result of the flood. apart from the flood stories around the world. But I believe that, it makes much more sense. God created 6,000 years ago. Man lived for 1,500 years and then was catastrophically overwhelmed and buried. That this is not the remains of anything, a pre-Adamic creation, but the remains of the world of Noah's day. And as I said, we've got these footprints and animal tracks side by side, indicating they lived together. And we have fossils of ephemeral things like a leaf. Now, a leaf, in a few weeks and months, the worms have eaten it, it doesn't get preserved. There's something strange has caused leaves to be preserved, and even raindrops have been found in fossils. And worm tracks, things which normally would just disappear very rapidly, but something strange has happened, and the flood is the really only explanation. And as I said, it is clear that these animals were alive, and this particular fish, and let's just enlarge it up, was in the process of swallowing another fish, having its meal, when suddenly, bam, it is turned into a fossil. It hasn't just died and over a period of time turned into a fossil. It's just going further in there. And this Ichthyosaurus is giving birth to its young. Again, just to enlarge that up. Now, there's every indication that, a live birth, there's nothing there. But suddenly, something happened to it. It was overwhelmed, covered in sediment. Great pressure turned into a fossil. And the real killer is that when you buy shellfish, if they are open, then you know that they're not fresh or new, because the mussels relax after it's died and they open up. But you never find any fossils of shellfish which are open. They're all in the shut position to show that when they were fossilised, they were alive. Some catastrophe has overtaken them. So the traditional ideas of evolution that, they die and somehow they get fossilised. And as you can see just how shut they are. I'm sorry, I've gone the wrong way. And when you think of the depth of... big, isn't it? That's got to be covered in sediment to be fossilised. So that indicates a tremendous amount of sedimentation to overwhelm a creature like that. And it's not just as if there's one dinosaur found, but, you find thousands of dinosaurs all been overwhelmed. The floods, explains the mechanism that evolution and ages of time doesn't. And there's this polystrate, there's a tree trunk. No, we're going to come back to that, but I just put this up. So this is the traditional geological column with all its different divisions in it. One has to say that one doesn't find examples of all these anywhere, bar I think there's about 0.4% of the Earth you can find representatives from all of these layers. But each of those layers is divided up into lots of intermediate layers, and many of them are completely missing. Or you have older rocks on top of younger rocks. It's all topsy-turvy. What you see in the textbook doesn't really exist. That is how man has chosen to put it together. 0.4% can you get representatives from all of those, all found together, but not necessarily in the right order, mixed up. Normally everything is very incomplete and very often out of sequence, and millions of years are just apparently missing from the evolutionary viewpoint. So, that's allegedly 570 million years to go from the Cambrian to today. It's much more reasonable, I think, to say that represents what happens during the flood. See, on the evolutionist viewpoint, that layer, allegedly 136,000 metres thick, works out at about 0.2 millimetres a year, which is fractional. You know, I'm not going to bury a dinosaur for hundreds and thousands of years at that kind of rate. You see, conventional wisdom says 0.2 millimetres a year, so on that scale there's a centimetre, take 50 years for that. That's good old-fashioned people with the inch, 125 years. It will take over 8,000 years to get to the height of a person. So when we come back to our polystrate fossil there, now, how could that tree trunk exist for 8,000 years, just slowly being buried? It must have been buried all in one go, which is a tremendous amount of strata. You see, the whole basis of evolution is things don't change. We can use what is happening at the present to interpret the past. Uniformitarianism is the religion of evolutionists. And it just doesn't work. Doesn't work. Great problem. So, yeah, better explanation. Now, a flood, we would expect to see the marine creatures at the bottom, and the more agile creatures would go high up. And when one looks at the edge of this fossil, you can see it's built up of lots of little layers. And yet that fish has been beautifully preserved. Now, as I say, evolutionary ideas, probably each of those layers represents, years to make sense. But the flood laying lots of layers, thin layers, but rapidly, and therefore being able to overwhelm and beautifully preserve a fish makes much more sense. The time period is absolutely mind-boggling. They say from the beginning of the Big Bang, 4.6 billion years, but as far as life is concerned in the Cambrian layer to today, that's about 570 million years, according to their theories. And yet, in that Cambrian layer, we have sophisticated life. There's nothing simple about the life that we find there. And say all the different families are represented in that layer. But, you take creatures like these trilobites. Yeah, I'm getting old. I'm very tired as well. Trilobites. They are so sophisticated. There's nothing simple about them at all. And yet there they are on the bottom layer. They have these eyes. Each eye is made up of between 100 and 15,000 different individual lenses to each eye. And within each of those lenses, it is made up of two parts, calcite and chitin. And it is thought that that was so it could see undistorted under the water. But, a multifaceted eye. This is no simple creature. Just the very thought of an eye evolving, as Darwin says, left him cold. So here are creatures down at the bottom with these most sophisticated eyes to them. And interestingly, we go to the Smithsonian Institute, which has the biggest collection, 45 million fossils in its collection of about 250,000 different creatures. You would expect they would have fossils of all hundreds, thousands of missing links, but there are no undisputed missing links to be shown. They just don't exist. And this again is glossed over by the evolutionists, of course, but it's very serious. If you can't see that there is a transition from one creature to another, why should we believe in evolution? Well, we believe God created each creature. It happened instantly. God said it happened. So as I say, each of the 26 major groups we can find in the Cambrian layer, but no previous ancestors. Just a sudden burst of life is what we find from the fossils. Now, recent events like the eruption of Mount St. Helens, which, if you're as old as I am, that's recent. To some of you, that's history, isn't it? 1980. But in 1980, Mount St. Helens in America was the most observed great eruption that has been witnessed by man. That's what the mountain looked like before it blew its top. That's what was blown off. The whole of the top disappeared, and great changes to the whole region. And it is estimated the power in that volcanic catastrophe equivalent to 20,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs. And it carved out valleys and formed strata in just a few days, few weeks. In fact, the depth of that was 180 metres. It's like a miniature Grand Canyon to a 1/40th scale. It didn't take millions of years. Happened a very small period of time. On traditional evolutionary scale, if you hadn't known what had happened and it hadn't all been witnessed, you would have gone there and said, right, well, there's 9 million years worth of rock formation there, but we know that wasn't the case at all. Now, I have to confess, I've always talked about the man at the bottom. And because I've got a bigger screen now at home, I've realised this is a lady. So the lady at the bottom gives us a bit of scale. But that was formed in one day. That was formed in another day, about 2 months later. And that was formed in another day, about 2 years later. And this was all part of the great disturbance at the time. And those layers there, if you went to them and you were a geologist and nobody had told you, you'd look at those and see them as quite normal geological strata made up of lots of little layers, and then another different strata on top made up of all different layers. But as I say, it ended up at a 1/40th scale of the Grand Canyon. There's just another view of it. Now, the interesting thing, when we think about strata, is that if evolution were correct, you'd have a layer, and then it would get eroded until the next layer came along and would fit over that troughs and humps and then that would then get eroded, another layer would come on, and so on. And that's what you would expect to see. But it isn't what you find. What you find are perfectly good layers matching between each other, not really showing a sign of weatherings between, which would indicate that the timescale that is traditionally used is quite faulty. This fits in a short period of time of the flood. But if you're going to have millions of years, you'd expect to have erosion between them. Now, I've still not mastered the art of doing video clips, so we have to have it in slow motion. What people would traditionally say, if they looked at that cross-section, is that that strata is older than that strata and much older than that strata there. That as we go up, we're getting younger and younger. Further down we go, we get older and older. But the thing is, we can do experimentation. That is an evolutionary assumption, but we can do experimentation with stratification. And I'll give you a link to a very interesting website which demonstrates this. But what experiments show is that that isn't an age differentiation, that is a size of the particle differentiation. And what water does as it flows along, different sized particles separate out and form layers simultaneously. And they're all the same age. So what happens as the water flows and it's carrying sediment with it, it is deposited according to its weight. And so these grow, sideways, as it were, all the same day at the same time. So if we just think of the flood, and this is the earth before the flood, the waters come and rise, and then with tidal waves, we get these rocks being formed, sedimentation, thousands of feet of it totally. And then the flood waters go down, and as the waters go down, these rocks are very soft, and the water runs off, and it cuts its valleys and its hills and that. But these aren't millions of years. These represent a short period of time, the period within the flood. And within all those layers, and multiply that 100-fold layers, this is just very simplistic, are the remains of the creatures that have been overwhelmed, and with the great temperature from the volcanic action, great pressure from the water, have done this unusual thing in turning their bodies into fossilised remains. So Mount St Helens helps us to get a handle that you can very rapidly get valleys being formed. You don't need long periods of time. And in the softness of newly formed layers, they then with water can be carved out. It's soft, it can be carved out. So if you just go into Google and just put stratification, that's all you need, put fascinating video where you see this machine and you watch the layers just separating out, but they crawl along like that sideways, not one and then another and then another. They're all going simultaneously. So what do the fossils point to? To evolution or a flood? Well, the fact that there is total absence of intermediate forms is a great barrier to the evolutionists. Life is very complex right from the beginning, which is a great problem for evolutionists. And there is no mechanism to form fossils. It needs rapid burial. And rapid burial and heat and pressure don't exist in everyday life. Whereas if we look to the flood, then, well, it was a catastrophic. The Bible makes that quite clear. It needed a flood. They were buried alive. There was the water, the strata to carry the creatures and bury them in the soft mud and gravel and all that was being carried along. And there was the heat and there was the pressure. And the stratification is a natural process, leaving us with all these different bands. So, where are we? Saturday morning, yes. Yesterday I was down at Hunstanton, and you go to the cliffs and you see all these cliffs, and they would say, well, that represents millions of years to get all to there. But, I believe that was formed in a short time, the time of the flood, and the different colours represent the different materials that were being carried and dropped out. So evolution has to assume that things haven't changed. This uniformitarianism that, as I say, we use the present to give us the key to the past just isn't true. If the Bible's true, things aren't the same. There was a catastrophic flood which altered everything and has a great bearing on their attempts to date things. The Bible tells us, yes, things have changed. It makes it quite clear before the flood, certain conditions. After the flood, there were seasons and rain, and it was much shorter lives. And it gives us the mechanism: fossils underwater, change rocks underwater, and changes in climate. And we have to factor all those in when we're looking at time scales and dating. And also the Earth's magnetic field is changing. That's something which can be seen. And that again has quite a bearing when we're trying to do dating and trying to say, when did all these things take place? And so evolution says, well, at the beginning there was nothing, a big bang, and then we begin to get forming all the different things that we have. So when we are trying to date something and measuring the half-lives, we're going back to zero at the beginning. Whereas if we believe that God was creating things, then we didn't start at zero. When God created, he created Adam and Eve not as day-old babies, but as grown-ups. He created the trees not as little tiny saplings, but they were bearing fruit. He formed trees with fruit on. He formed adult animals. He formed a sea which would have salt in it for the saltwater fish. We didn't start from nothing. We started with a mature earth. Now, evolutionists, say poo-poo to that, but we believe the Bible. And this all has a bearing on our dating process. So when evolutionists are dating things, because they assume that we've got to get back to zero for the beginning, that's going to give a longer length of time than if we believe, well, we started off with this amount of carbon-14 or whatever it was at the beginning, and now we got to this, and so we work our way back. Also, because the rocks of the Earth were underwater for over a year, anything that we're trying to analyse, water is a wonderful solvent and it will leach out. So if your sample that you've been examining now was at the time of the flood underwater for a whole year, then again it is not going to contain the same amounts as at the time when it was first buried. Over that year it would leach out. So again, when we come to do our dating, we're going to get ages which are much longer than the reality, because there's going to be less in because of being leached out in the flood. And conditions were different, magnetic fields, atmospheric pressure. All these very subtly alter dating. So evolutionists are always going to come up with ages which are much longer than the reality. They don't normally bother to date coal, but when they do, they get a date of about 33,000 years ago, whereas on evolutionary ideas it should be 250,000 years ago, 250,000 million years ago. And I have no problems with 33,000 years, because as I say, I believe that was coal and the oil was formed in the time of the flood. But because of all the leaching and that, yes, you are going to get a longer age in reality. But, it's so totally different from what they expect. And here we have Mount St. Helens. We know that erupted in 1980. And yet we go to the lava and you apply your traditional dating to the lava from that, and it gives an age of 350,000 years using the potassium amalgam method. And yet we know it was only formed in 1980. Wood found in Cambrian rock, which is right at the bottom of the pile, supposed to be millions of years old, dates to 4,000 years. I'm not going to try and pronounce it. I've seen it, but it has this unpronounceable name, unless you're New Zealander. Again, gives vast ages, millions of years, but we know that what they're dating is actually no older than 1949. So there's something wrong. Oil. Again, when one dates oil, you get a very young age, not millions of years old. So things like carbon-14, that was one of the earliest dating methods. According to evolution, there shouldn't be any carbon-14 after 100,000 years, and yet we find carbon-14 in the coal and diamonds and oil, which is a great puzzle, which indicates that it's not as old as it's cracked out to be, much younger. Therefore, we still have got carbon-14, which should, with all the half-lives, have all disappeared. But that's not the reality. So, flood stories around the Earth. We have well-known Babylonian accounts and Ebla tablets and Nineveh tablets. The Bible is the original. The others are the distorted stories. But we find accounts from all over the world. There's over 200 flood traditions from Europe and Asia, Australia, East Indies, Melanesia, Polynesia, South America, Central America, East Africa, all having stories of some far back time there was a flood. And common to them all is this recollection that this flood destroyed the earth and there was a new start, and there were just a few escapes. This is a common theme. Many of them involve the building of a big ark to preserve life. And there's John Morris, not our John Morris, but a John Morris, who collated these stories. There were differences between the stories, but he drew up this chart, and was there a favoured family? Well, in over, what's that, probably about 85%. There's 100% at the end there. So, the vast majority of them all talked about there was a chosen race who was preserved. Were they forewarned? Well over 50%. Flood due to wickedness. All these things which show clearly that these stories have their origins in the reality of what the Bible tells us of the flood. That is then carried as people dispersed around the world. That story would get carried, get distorted, get corrupted. But, by putting it in a channel like that, it shows how interesting these stories are. And the founder of the Chinese civilization was said to have escaped with his wife, his 3 sons, and his 3 daughters. So there's the Chinese in their history. The founder of the Chinese, so the descendant from Noah who came and founded the Chinese dynasty, that's in their history. And it is in fact incorporated into their language, because their language is made up of pictures. Their word for a boat consists of the symbol for a vessel, a container, 8 people. You couldn't make that up, could you? It only makes sense that their word, which they use today for a boat, has its origins way back when, at the beginnings of their foundation, of their civilization, 8 people were preserved. And the word that they have for tradition, for handing down information, that is, again, you see 2 of them the same, but it's water, 8, and person. So, back in their history, this concept of being able to pass information on has, in the pictogram of their language, this idea of 8 people and something to do with water. In fact, there's a whole DVD back there about Chinese language, and it's how it proves the Bible account. Absolutely incredible. Even on the Fiji people, it's only a canoe, but that's understandable, isn't it? Because a big boat to people in the Fiji wouldn't make much sense. But 8 people were saved. That's in their tradition, that at their founding, 8 people were saved in a canoe in water. Many nations trace their origins to Noah. I'm not stocking it at the moment because I have a bit of a job to get it, but you go on internet. Fascinating book. There's a copy in the lobby. After the Flood by this Bill Cooper. And he traces genealogies of all sorts of nations, the 70 nations, British history and that, and takes it back using the ancient chronicles back to a grandson of Noah. It's absolutely marvellous. Fascinating book. And, just simple things. If we accept the Bible, and there were 3 families 4,300 years ago, time of the flood, then we would expect to have the kind of population we have today. Whereas if man was on Earth for 20,000 years, and a lot longer in evolutionary terms, there should be total overcrowding. And there is an acknowledgement now of genetics. To begin with, they were pointing the finger and saying, this shows that the Bible isn't true. But the more they're doing with genetics, the more they find that they come from a common Eve. And they use the word Eve, don't they? Not that they accept the sea, but yes, all nations do have this common origin. We had a brother at rugby who studied this and gave us a fascinating 3-part talk on genetics. It's on the internet. So, yes, we're near at the end. I know time has gone on. I do go on. I do apologise, but I hope things aren't burnt offerings down below. Noah's 16 grandsons can all be shown to be historic people who gave their names to countries or rivers or places or the gods of where they emigrated to. But you can work out where they all moved to. And as I say, there must have been land bridges for the animals and man to go, but as time moved on, then those land bridges were broken. Therefore, you got interbreeding purely within the group that were there on the island, and therefore specific characteristics which we see today would come to the fore. But that's an absolutely fascinating study. So the Genesis flood, fact that there was a flood is a great challenge to the evolutionists. And of course, it's a warning for today. And we can be quite certain that the evolution is a theory which is built on shifting foundations. It is a sand. And the day will come when the Lord Jesus is here, and men and women will have to acknowledge that they have inherited lies and that there is a God. And how fascinating that the passage in Revelation chapter 14 that talks about the preaching of the gospel says, "Fear God and give glory to him that made heaven, earth, seas, fountains of water." The very thing that men and women refuse to acknowledge today, we know that that is what they're going to be forced to acknowledge. If they don't, they will be destroyed. But the Bible is a rock. It doesn't matter how difficult it is to get up to the house, but it is a strong, firm foundation, and the Bible will stand. And the part of the Bible is the Genesis flood, and we can trust it. So these are some of the sources of information answered in Genesis and Creation Ministries, which I get my DVDs and books from. Websites, all sorts of feed-in from websites there. I'll go back to that and leave it up to see if you want to take some notes. So just my final one, I think. Might be another. We have Jesus' warning that, as in the days of Noah, now I admit that in the first instance, Jesus was talking about the events of AD 70, and in a similar situation, they ignored the signs of the coming of the Lord Jesus and destruction upon his nation. But very clearly, we have the secondary application to our day, that people are ignoring God, and we know it, and how rapidly this persecution of Christianity in this country is absolutely overwhelming, isn't it? Now in schools, teachers are not allowed. It is against the law to teach creation and the Bible principles of marriage and all the rest of it. We're having to change our constitution because we have a licence, as you probably have here, for marriages, and we've got to change the constitution, make it clear that it is for our members and only between man and wife, because, we could be forced otherwise to accept the standards of this world. But as Hebrews says, we need faith. We haven't got all the answers, but God's word makes sense. We look at the world around with the Bible in hand, and we can see, that all fits. The evolutionists can't do that. They have to keep on revamping their theories. The more things they find, the more changes they have to make. And so we have to walk by faith. So we live in Noah-like days. The hallmark of today is violence, isn't it? And soon God's judgments are to be felt. And we have to share the faith of Noah. And Genesis is true from the beginning. So I'm just going to go back to that one, in case you want to just record it. And then over to the President. Thank you.